The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Rick Wilson, Republican political strategist and author of Everything Trump Touches Dies, a Republican strategist gets real about the worst president ever. Rick Wilson, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And our pleasure to have you with us. And we should point out, you were one of the original Never Trumpers. When did you first realize the damage this candidate could do?
My sort of revelatory moment with Donald Trump and what he would do to the Republican Party happened sometime in the spring of 2015 when the rumors of Trump's desire to get in the race started to surface. And I've worked in Republican politics for nigh on 30 years now, and I realized that the showmanship, the reality TV nature of Donald Trump, the professional wrestling aspect of it, could combine with the power that Fox News has over the Republican electorate and turn this into something that departed from all the conservative principles that I'd ever worked for, and turn it into something hideous. And I think we're seeing that prediction pay out every day, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we can debate for hours about why he won. But from your perspective, as a Republican strategist and committed conservative, how did the party itself let this happen?
Well, this is partly why I wrote my book, to describe the moral and political and intellectual collapse of the Republican Party and the conservative movement in the wake of the rise of Trump. And I think there are a couple of big answers and a couple of small answers. The way we let it happen was that the leadership inside the party, in the form of Reince Priebus and others, completely underestimated the impact that allowing Trump to continue to commit these excesses and continuing to behave in the way he did would build up a vicious cycle of news coverage that eventually blotted out the sun for every other candidate, and eventually led to everyone else in that giant field of serious people getting not just a half or a third or a quarter, but fractions of a percent of the coverage Trump was getting. So the combination of a news ecosystem that was fundamentally broken, Trump's continued and loud attacks, became great news fodder. You had the Fox News machine, which it speaks very directly to 90 million households every day, and they were giving, by midway through the race, there was no other candidate in the race with that. You had a large infrastructure of grifters, hucksters, scumbags, weirdos, profiteers, etc., around the Trump movement, all of whom were part of that professional evangelical and professional populist class that we've seen emerge in the country, who really wanted a guy they could easily manipulate and could push towards their agenda items. Steve Bannon is a good case in point on that. This is a guy who has a clear ideology. Trump has no clear ideology except his own ego, but Bannon and the rest of these guys very much saw that they could use him as a vector and rely on some of his baser instincts to carry forth things that they know they couldn't sell because they were too egregiously racist or egregiously xenophobic or egregiously just cruel. in a broader sense. So, that collapse inside of the GOP, and not killing off this horrible virus early in the process, is what led us to this to the pass we're at today.
Mm-hmm. How big a factor do you think was race in the election of Donald Trump?
Well, this is the thing that can, for all the tough talk from Republicans about how Trump has let them be the party of real talk and the party of the real America, and as much as Trump's excusers want to say, oh, it was about economic insecurity and it was about elites in Washington, an awful lot of it, at the end of the day, with an awful lot of folks, were down to a very ugly final message, which was Donald Trump is the avatar against the brown people who make us scared. And I will say this, there's a fairly long chapter in the book, and going through the history of Republicans and race, good and bad, okay? Good and bad. But we have never had a president in this country in our lifetimes who was as assertively racially dog whistling as this man. And I think race was a meaningful factor with a lot of folks. And I've had to say this a million times, and I mean it. Not every Trump supporter is a xenophobic, racist jerk, but every single xenophobic, racist jerk both is a Trump supporter, and they believe that Donald Trump has given them permission now to articulate their hatred of people who don't look like them, and given them permission now to engage in both political and governmental behavior that is explicitly informed by race or by religion.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Rick Wilson, Republican political strategist, author of Everything Trump Touches Dies, a Republican strategist gets real about the worst president ever. Rick, we have now gone past electing to enabling, and you target many actors in that role. For example, how are social conservatives enabling Donald Trump?
Well, look, social conservatives for many, many years told people that we have a strict moral code, and that our moral code of evangelical Christianity must be reflected in our national political life. And that if candidates want the support of evangelicals, and if candidates want the support of social conservatives, then they have to not only have certain policy beliefs, but they also have to have certain behavioral traits and personal traits that show that they live those beliefs and show that they live those principles. And what we've seen is that Donald Trump has a get out of jail free card from social conservatives on every single issue. And I hate to agree with Ann Coulter on something, but she framed it out in a way that I think that really turned out to be accurate. She said, if Donald Trump will do this immigration plan, he could do an abortion on the front lawn of the White House and nobody will care. Well, she was kind of right. And they don't care what Trump does or is, as long as they're getting judges that they think are going to give them the outcomes that they cannot win at the ballot box or in society. And so as a Republican, strategist and ad maker for a long time, I've worked all over the country. Okay. And so I've worked to elect Republicans in blue states and big cities. I did Rudy Giuliani's mayor's race in New York. I elected a Democrat or a Republican governor in Democratic Vermont 4 times. And I've been around the block in a lot of places across the country where if you came up with a cookie cutter Republican candidate in those places, who had to take orders from central command and be rigidly pro-life or rigidly pro-Second Amendment, you weren't going to win in that place. You weren't going to do it. You couldn't close the deal. Well, evangelicals for years lost their damn minds about it. How dare you try to elect somebody who isn't perfect? Well, they have now set a new standard and have a new principle involved here, which is as long as we get the judges we want to do the things that we want to do socially, we're all good. And my difficulty with some of this is that, A, I don't think that a political monoculture is a good thing broadly, and B, as a conservative and a constitutionalist, I don't believe that social engineering on the right is any more meritorious than social engineering on the left. So I don't think it's the government's business to tell people who can get married to who. If you're consenting adults, competent consenting adults, it's not the government's job to tell you can't get married to somebody. They don't believe that, though. They don't believe in the conservative principle of limited government power when it comes to gay marriage, for instance, which I find as a sort of libertarian inflected conservative to be ridiculous. But now they've got a guy who says, "I'll do it for you. I'll take care of it for you." Right. So I think that's an area, by the way, of where the left and the right in this country right now have a lot more. There are a lot more folks in the middle on that question than almost anything else. And I've often just wondered at the shocking desire of these guys to manipulate the judicial system in order to game an outcome where society has absolutely made up its mind. We're okay with gay marriage. We're okay with gay people in our society. It's not perfect. We're not all there yet in terms of all the questions of equality, but the fraction of people right now who believe that gay marriage should be banned by the government and that gay adoptions and so on should be banned by the government is gratifyingly small. But there are people that are supporting Trump because they believe that he will take those steps.
Well, and it's amazing to me and yet it holds so much sway. With it being such a small amount of the population that believes that, and yet it has a lot of power.
We started out in the world where you had in the Republican Party, the three big legs of the stool. You had social conservatives, you had economic conservatives, and the folks who were motivated by free markets, lower taxes, etc. And you had national security folks. So the current Republican Party consists of Donald Trump and social conservatives. The economic conservatives have either abandoned that principle completely, or there's nothing they can do right now to tighten, budgetary discipline or anything like that. And the national security conservatives are watching a president mortgage the country to Russia. So the SOCONs are getting what they wanted. They're the winners in this contest so far.
Sure. Now that Donald Trump has been in office for a year and a half, what kind of impact has this had on the Republican Party and the conservative movement?
Well, there is no Republican Party to speak of today. It is a one-man show. It is a personality-driven, top-down. The word cult is often overused, but we're damn close to that at this point. And the principles that once informed the Republican Party of limited government, of free markets, of free trade, of fiscal discipline, of individual liberty, have all been thrown aside, and it is transformed into the Trumpian nationalist populist party you see today. And with varying degrees of felicity and smoothness. Some of these guys are really embarrassingly bad at this. Some of them are some of them believe it. Most of them don't. They're just faking it. But you can't have a party that changes its ideological bearings 180 degrees on all these major policy areas and still call it a party.
Mm-hmm. Moving beyond Republicans, what concerns you most about President Trump's impact on the nation as a whole?
Well, I think there are three big areas that I find deeply concerning. The first is Donald Trump's affection for a kind of authoritarian, top-down, l'état-c'est-moi form and style of governance. Republicans objected very, very, very strenuously when Barack Obama was sort of stuck with a Congress that wouldn't do what he wanted, and so he did a lot of governing by executive order. And Republicans threw up their hands and screamed and yelled and said, "Oh, this is awful. We can't do this. This is against our fundamental principles as a republic, and he's a statist." And blah, blah, blah. Well, Donald Trump, saving one tax bill, Donald Trump is governed almost exclusively by executive order. I don't like power to be reposed into the hands of the executive, particularly when the executive is driven by ego, vanity, conflicts, and all the sort of pathologies that define Donald Trump. Because I believe the founders had a genius in their construction of the way this government operated, of three independent and co-equal branches. And we're seeing that completely diminished. The Republicans in Congress have, they act as if they are employees of Trump rather than members of that co-equal branch. And I think there's a great and disturbing set of moral compromises he's made in this country, in terms of Russia, in terms of our role in the world, in terms of his adoption of some of this nationalism and populism that he has, turned into the centerpiece of our foreign policy now, which is to reduce our standing in the world, to reduce our relationships with allies, to break down the institutions that have helped make the world, relatively peaceful and prosperous for generations. I find that incredibly disturbing. And there is a certain degree of Trump that I find, I don't want to say aesthetically disturbing, but I think that a lot of the way he behaves and governs and speaks and communicates and divides us is, in the end, going to diminish us as a country, and to sort of take away some of the hard-won image of this country as a place that that isn't ideal and not a race or a homeland. I think that he's diminished our ability to be a beacon in the world, very, very strongly diminished it. And because of that, I find that both sad and troubling. And that idea that this is a propositional nation is one that was deeply embedded in our founding, and deeply embedded in the arc we've traveled ever since then. But in Donald Trump's case, it's not a propositional nation. He gets to decide what religion is okay. He gets to decide what race or what country or ethnic nationality or ethnic origin is okay. And there are good Americans who kneel when he tells them and don't and stand when he tells them. And there are bad Americans who have thoughts that are opposed to him. I think that the combination of those three big streams is sort of the basic indictment on Trump and his character. Also, he's completely compromised by the Russians. He's crooked as hell.
Yeah, then there's that.
There's that.
Yeah, right. We're speaking with Rick Wilson, Republican political strategist, author of Everything Trump Touches Dies, a Republican strategist gets real about the worst president ever. Rick, there's no shortage of books now that portray American democracy itself at risk under the sway of an authoritarian ruler. Do you share those concerns?
I do find that the trend lines in the world of Donald Trump are leading us towards some places that as a Western liberal democracy, we ought not go. And I think that there's a combination of forces between Trump's impulsivity and between his desire to have instant obedience and control over people, and his desire to try to treat the country as if the Trumps were a royal family and not just mere residents and employees of the people of America. I find all those things and all that authoritarian, curious behavior on his part. He loves Vladimir Putin. He hates everybody else. He loves Duterte in the Philippines. He hates everybody else. He praises Kim being able to make his people, instantly sit up and obey. All these things, combined with the impulsivity and combined with the fact that there is a largely compliant media apparatus that exists every day to say that Donald Trump is the tallest, handsomest, smartest man in the world, and that nothing he does is wrong, and the lack of any congressional oversight and any congressional accountability. I think those combinations, if you're inclined to be an authoritarian asshole and you're suddenly given the tools to do it and nobody's going to tell you no, things go wrong quickly.
Mm-hmm. After the president's meeting with Vladimir Putin, you wrote a piece in the Daily Beast with this title: Helsinki is Congress's wake-up call. Republicans in the House and Senate must finally hold Trump to account. What are the chances that that will actually happen?
Well, the chances after November are a lot better because this Republican Congress is utterly disinterested in anything to do with keeping Donald Trump honest about the Russia situation. They are in fact aggressively attempting to help him navigate out of it. They are aggressively attempting to manipulate and aggressively attempting to sabotage the Mueller investigation and any other investigation and any ability of this country to secure itself against future interference by Russia. So they have abdicated their responsibilities so profoundly and so thoroughly that as a lifelong Republican, I in many ways Trump's behavior was expected. He is a guy who has a predictable set of bad behaviors. What has truly shocked me is the utter, complete abdication of Paul Ryan and other members of the leadership who I know personally, and I know these guys are not the caricature of the mouth-breathing Trump lover, but they are so afraid of him and so afraid of his base that they have engaged in a pattern of behavior now that, in order to protect them, that is utterly reprehensible in every way. And I don't know how you ever unring that bell as a party. When you're standing up with a man who is assertively destroying the principles your party claims to stand for, and hip deep in a Russian information warfare operation that was set up to divide and diminish this country, and frankly to elect Donald Trump as president, and who is this lavishly corrupt figure that you can't live down. They don't get to walk away from this later and go, yeah, I was just I was just a temporary Trumper. I was just play acting. I was role playing. No, you don't get to do that. So, that's what's been my biggest shock in this thing is that these people who I know publicly and privately who have enormous reservations about Trump, who do not like him as a person, who do not believe he is a good president or a good person or a moral or ethical leader, still go up there, put the red hat on, and pretend that everything's great. And I'm a cynical guy. I've been in a cynical business for a long time. Sorry, I just dropped something on the floor. I apologize. I'll start over. I'm a cynical guy. I've been in a cynical business for a very long time. But it is breathtaking. It is breathtaking what we see every day with members of Congress who understand how dangerous and how corrupt and how utterly wrong this man is, and out of fear of him and fear of his base, and in some cases a sort of opportunistic understanding that they could really, try to leverage themselves as the next Donald Trump, only slightly less, mouth breathing. It is a combination of forces that has made everyone look like the worst possible caricatures of shameless and feckless and cowardly political figures. It's a disaster.
Now, obviously, you are a Republican political strategist, as we've talked about. You've been doing this for a long time. In your view, what does the Republican Party need to do to repair the damage of Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, after World War II in France, the people who had been in the Vichy government collaborating with the Nazis had something called the Épuration légale, which was this moment of reconciliation and accountability for people who had helped Hitler. Now, a lot of them went to jail. A lot of them lost their property. A lot of them lost their liberty. And a good number of them were hung by the neck. But that moment where you reconcile and you basically have a hard break with the past, and you say, okay, what we have done here is wrong. What we've done here is in some ways, needs a few examples to stand as a warning for the future. So there are going to be people in this party, if you want to save it, and I honestly don't know I honestly don't know that Republicans want to save the party right now. If they want a conservative party, they may have to reboot a new one and make it up from scratch. But but if they want to save the GOP from Trump, if they want to transform it into something that is about limited government, constitutional fealty, fiscal discipline, they're going to have to take the hit. They're going to have to take a hard political shot to the head, and admit what they've done. They're going to have to live down this whole thing that they've engaged in, and that's not easy for people. It's not psychologically easy. It's not politically easy. But the corrective may end up being that the Democrats win a majority, and we finally get some actual accountability on the White House. And they may have to just face it. And I think back about Nixon, and I think there's a relevant case to be made that in 1973 the Republicans were with Nixon to the hilt. They were not going to do anything. They were going to protect him. It was literally called a witch hunt. And by 1974 they realized they were defending a guy who was guilty.
Right.
And in politics, there's nothing worse for the voters. I've seen this over the years. There's almost nothing worse for the voters than lies to cover corruption. Lies to cover corruption make the voters angry as hell. There are a lot of times where the guy will get a reputation as being a scumbag or corrupt or venal, and people will kind of excuse it for a long time. Oh yeah, he's our scumbag. This is Jim Trafficant, writ large. Okay, they obviously corrupt, but had a kind of lovable rogue nature. Well, in this case, I think there are people who Trump's an asshole, but he's our asshole is a very frequent refrain on the right. And I think that you're going to end up with, as people realize he's not just an asshole, he's a guy who has hidden a lot from us, who has behaved in reprehensible ways, who has compromised this country and our security in really meaningful ways. And when that's exposed, it's harder for the GOP at that point to just sit up and go, it's all fine. It's all good. We're fine. No problem here. Moving on. So,
well,
I volunteered to chair the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Well, as we mentioned at the top, you're one of the leaders of the Never Trump movement of Republicans. How do you envision its future, especially as Donald Trump's polling well with Republican voters?
No, he's not polling well with Republican voters. He's polling wonderfully with Republican voters. But this is like saying that the head of the Flat Earth Society is considered credible by the rest of the members of the Flat Earth Society. A lot of what Donald Trump's doing to the party is shrinking it. So as a pollster friend of mine said to me the other day, he goes, yeah, I'm doing more calls to get my Republican samples now. And he thinks that's an early indicator, because people are drifting out of the GOP, or they're suddenly getting soft on saying that they're Republicans. And what that means is the base itself is shrinking in the short term. And that's going to join up with the base itself shrinking in the long term, because there's a demographic reality here that the GOP is facing. It is getting older. It is getting to the point where let me loop back one second. I'll give you a good example. When Rush Limbaugh burst on the scene in the late 80s, mid-late 80s, his audience was about 45 years old. In the 90s, his audience was about 55 years old. In the 2000s, they were about 65 years old. Now, it's the same story with Fox. the demos keep drifting northward. And so the people that are strongly responding to that Trumpian current message tend to be older, they tend to be whiter, they tend to be much more driven by television news. And so, we're seeing a party that has burned its bridges with millennials. We're seeing a party that has burned its bridges with African Americans and Hispanics, probably in a sort of on the Hispanic front, in a way that we haven't even reckoned with yet. And the upcoming pool of voters is not showing the behavior that used to occur in voting populations, which as they got older, they got more conservative. We're not seeing that right now. We're also seeing an element of the Republican Party where Republicans were able to hold on in a few places in the country that on paper should have probably gone to Democrats, but Northern Virginia suburbs, Philly suburbs, et cetera. But in a lot of those places, they've lost a very, very important demographic, and that is college-educated people. And the other demographic they're losing in almost real time, you can almost watch the numbers poll to poll drift down, is women. Republican women are running away from the party as fast as they can. They do not like Donald Trump. Part of it's an aesthetic choice. Part of it's a decency choice. But, I don't know if you're a Republican and you're not just in the business of making excuses, you're not comfortable watching, kids in cages. You're not comfortable seeing kids torn away from their moms. You respond to that on a visceral level. A lot of women voters respond to issues about families on a visceral level. And so this sense of shock and terror that was played out on television for several weeks on the border situation did not accrue to the benefit of the GOP with women at all. And Trump, as he's further exposed as a high or low grade sexual predator and scumbucket, I think he's going to have, it becomes increasingly difficult for women to say, yeah, that's the kind of man I want my kids to act like. That's right. The kind. There's a role model for my kids. I don't think you're going to hear that very much. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point too, because and that's not talked about a whole lot, but we supposedly we learn from the adults, we learn from our elders, we learn from those in higher positions, and boy, oh boy, you don't want your kid learning that. Hey, Rick, some critics of the Never Trump movement say its members should leave the party. How do you respond?
Well, here's the thing. Last time I checked, the membership of the party is still open to people with a brain and guts and a heart, and if I have to put too fine a point on it, I'm willing to help break it if I have to rebuild it, because I do think that there right now is not another option for people who believe in limited government and constitutional fealty and fiscal discipline. Although I will say for the Democrats, one of the biggest opportunities the Democrats have right now to capture an enormous number of sensible people is to put on the fiscal discipline hat, because Donald Trump and this Congress have spent money like drunken sailors. They've engineered a tax bill. And look, I am a low tax guy. I think taxes have traditionally been too high and too punitive and all this other stuff. But this tax bill was engineered by hedge fund managers to pay off other hedge fund managers and to do exactly what it's done, which is to let corporations do gigantic stock buybacks and reward their executives for it. I know this to be a fact because one of the people that wrote the tax bill is a tax lobbyist friend of mine who sat in McConnell's office and wrote this bill. And, they do what they do, and God bless them, but it is a recipe for fiscal disaster. And I think there's a market opportunity for the Democrats if they're at some point adopt a less frivolous approach, because right now the Republicans have completely abandoned the field when it comes to fiscal probity of any kind.
Mm-hmm. Your book, Everything Trump Touches Dies. Is this a book you hope Democrats will read as well as Republicans?
I do hope Democrats will read it also, for two reasons. One, there's actually a chapter directed to the Democrats, sort of a "That's Why You Got Trump" chapter, with a little bit of strong medicine to talk about how they need to sort of reboot some of the ways they do campaigns and do politics, because the Democrats over the last 10 years, and it's not just gerrymandering, they've lost 1,000 seats. And a lot of it was because they got disconnected culturally. They started relying on some fairly narrow band tactics, and guys like me were able to come around and skunk up a bunch of Democratic seats that by rights should have been in the hands of the other party. But I hope they'll read it, and I also hope they'll read it with an understanding of just how far Trump is a deviant from conservative principles, and just how far Trump is set aside all the cliches that both parties like to deploy against each other. Trump is sui generis, and Trump is a character who presents enormous dangers to this country, in part because he represents something so different and so wrong, that's outside the political guardrails of both parties. I mean, the Democrats have not had the positional power to take on Donald Trump in a lot of ways, and they've lacked sort of the political celebrity power of any individual to come up against him.
How concerned?
The truth is that the superstar of the Democratic Party of the last 50 years has obviously been Barack Obama. And
right.
He has remained largely silent and largely on the sidelines for propriety reasons. As a former president, I know he doesn't want to get into the immediate scrum of everyday politics. But in all these cases, there's a huge celebrity deficit, and it's hard to beat a celebrity messaging unless you've got people who are equally adept at the environment of television and the environment of celebrity politics right now. I mean, Avenatti scares the hell out of him because the guy's just got mad skills all the time.
How concerned are you that Trump could get reelected?
Oh, yeah, I'm very concerned. There's a very good chance Trump gets reelected because, here's some tough talk and real talk. The cancer of Bernie Sanders inside the Democratic Party will probably going to make some heads explode here. But Bernie Sanders and his merry band of arsonists, I think arguably cost Hillary Clinton a meaningful amount of support during the election. And I think that there's a temptation to go to the hard Bernie wing and, go with the go full socialist and all that stuff. And that temptation will walk them into a trap where Trump will be able to get his base fired up into the stratosphere, and they'll pursue a portfolio of issues that will motivate the Republican base in ways that it won't be a referendum on Trump. And I'll just tell you, if this turns out to be, if the Democratic nominee is, say, Kamala Harris, this will be a race about the Second Amendment, and the Democrats will lose. They'll just lose. It doesn't matter if you believe in gun control or you don't. It's the political vector of that issue. When there's a horrifying mass shooting, everyone screams and goes, "Oh my God, it has to change." It doesn't change. And then the political disconnect on that issue alone is one that you guys will end up winning 6 states, and Trump will scooch another win if you're not very careful about that issue. And I know what the polls say, but I've seen it 100 times in races from county commissioners to governors, and when you break on that issue, you give the Republican Party the one thing they need, which is a motivating, rally around the flag issue that is, a visceral, emotional red line issue for them. and they care about it in ways that Democrats don't care about any other single issue. Maybe abortion on the Democratic side, but it is a white hot thing, and if it becomes the issue in 2020, I think Trump has a good chance of being reelected. Now, of course, that all controls for externalities, and that's all with the presumption that Robert Mueller drops dead tomorrow and they lose all the files. There may be plenty more here that change the terrain between now and then. And there may be plenty of other exposures about Trump that make the politics meaningfully different than they are right now. But we control for what we know. Well, we control for what we know in this case. And like I said, the celebrity question. If I were helping the Democrats select a candidate, candidate quality is incredibly important. It's vital. Getting candidates who can do this work is really important. And sometimes they're right on the policies and they're right on the programmatic stuff, but not good at the work. And if you're not good at politics and good at campaigning and good at speaking and good at media, you need not apply, especially if you're running against a guy who is, for all the hateful shittiness of his whole life, he's good at media. Trump is good at dominating the conversation.
Right. And changing the focus of what should be discussed.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a long set of criteria you want in a candidate. But skill with the media is the modern criteria. It's the must-have of the 2000 teens.
Okay. Rick Wilson, Republican political strategist, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. He's the author of Everything Trump Touches, Everything Trump Touches Dies, a Republican strategist gets real about the worst president ever. Rick, thank you so much for your time with us today. We do appreciate it and look forward to hearing back from you again down the road.
You're very welcome. I appreciate it. Great conversation. Talk to you soon.
And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Perhaps you remember Senator Barry Goldwater, the GOP's fringy far-right-wing 1964 presidential nominee, who famously said, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice." Today, however, the core of the Republican Party has gone so far beyond the fringe that they would boo Goldwater's right-wingism as insufficiently rabid. Instead, their new rallying cry is, "Nuttiness in the defense of extremism is no vice." The GOP's mainline officialdom now proclaim themselves the party of extremism. They are openly embracing the crazy, including conspiracy theorists, neo-Confederates, and QAnon cultists, hoping to harness the fanatical horsepower of these anti-democratic groups to the party's true purpose of entrenching the supremacy of corporate and moneyed elites. Now, this extremism is about to erupt in the GOP's presidential primary, for a whole covey of these cooling right-wingers have fantasies of taking the group's radical agenda to the White House. All of them are trying to out-extreme each other with raw-meat bigotry and autocratic posturing. But two wannabes have emerged as both the most bullish and bullying: Greg Abbott of Texas and Ron DeSantis of Florida. For months, these big state governors have been locked in a far-right cook-off, including outlawing free speech, banning books, viciously attacking immigrants, preempting local elections and governments, and denying health care to poor people. Bear in mind that Abbott and DeSantis are not merely pontificating, posturing, and promising what they might do in the White House. As governors, they're actually practicing it right now. This is Jim Hightower saying, I don't know if Abbott and DeSantis are the worst that the GOP can do, but pay attention, for today's Republican elites intend to pull our democracy down into the plutocratic, autocratic, and theocratic maelstrom they're creating. Howdy-ho, folks. Thanks for tuning in and sharing my weekly commentaries. Also, please join me for a live web show I host every other Tuesday, the Hightower Lowdown Happy Hour at the Chat and Chew Cafe. You can join the action live online as I chat with grassroots leaders and progressive sparklies from around the country. Go to hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew to find out about upcoming guests and watch past episodes. That's hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee.
First of all, just the sheer scope of the change affected by the court this term, in areas ranging from abortion rights, obviously, to religion on the public square, to the ability to combat climate change. It has been really extraordinary what the court has done in terms of its results and also the way that it has reached those results. And I want to also point out part of that sentence. It said assertive. And I think that is, I might even go further to say aggressive. This is an aggressively conservative court. Another shift that court watchers have observed is that in a lot of ways, it doesn't feel like the Roberts court anymore. Chief Justice Roberts doesn't seem to have the control over the tone of the court that he used to. And it's now, you could say it's the Alito court or the Thomas court, but it's an even more aggressively conservative court than we've seen from the already conservative Roberts court.
I remember a phrase we used to hear a lot called legislating from the bench. When you look at the scope of decisions from this court and their aggressive or assertive nature, it seems like they're determined to legislate from the bench. These six justices.
The decision that came out on the last day of the term, West Virginia versus EPA, that deals with the ability of the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate carbon emissions under the Clean Air Act. Justice Kagan in her dissent says, a few years ago, I used the phrase, we're all textualists now. Well, I guess the majority isn't, except when it suits them. And that was exactly her point, was that, previously you'd had these conservatives talk about how important it was to follow the text of the statute or follow the Constitution as written and not, quote unquote, legislate from the bench. But, particularly in that case, they basically took it upon themselves to decide that it's not within the agency's expertise to regulate climate change. And in a whole host of other cases as well, the court basically second guesses what Congress did or what the drafters of our Constitution did and the people who ratified it.
Right. So there have been so many important, controversial, and consequential cases, but let's just talk about a few of them in sequence, starting with the Mississippi case on abortion you alluded to. Overall, what's the impact of that 6-3 decision as you see it?
The importance of that case is really unmeasurable. Although in many ways it can actually be measured. But, the immediate impact, of course, is on millions of Americans whose lives will be upended. There are really just heart-wrenching reports of desperate people at abortion clinics getting the news that they will not be given abortion health care because of that ruling. So there is an immediate impact on real people's lives because of that ruling, taking away the right to abortion. And then, of course, there are the broader implications for millions of Americans who have shaped their lives around being able to make this decision for themselves.
Yeah, for 50 years.
For 50 years, Roe has been the law for my entire life. And not to say a lot of us took these rights for granted. And I want to be clear that for many people, even with Roe in place, abortion rights were fairly illusory because of access issues and reproductive justice issues that particularly impacted brown and Black people across the country and people who had fewer means to access abortion care. But for many of us, we kind of took this right for granted, the idea that we'd always be able to make these decisions for ourselves. And to have that taken away without any good reason, and we can get into that in more detail, is really just a shock. A lot of people are waking up to just how outrageous this 6-justice majority is in their aggressive conservative push of the law and American society.
Well, in general, I mean, you are a legal scholar, constitutional scholar. When you look at the decision written by Samuel Alito, I mean, let's say if you were a law professor, how would you rate his legal reasoning to get to the decision that they all agreed on, 6 of them?
It is an unquestionable giant red F for failure.
Yeah.
The way that the majority opinion written by Justice Alito looks at the 14th Amendment gets the amendment completely wrong. The 14th Amendment was passed in the wake of the Civil War, after we had passed the 13th Amendment abolishing chattel slavery, when the nation was grappling with the question of what does it mean to be free as a matter of law, and how can we protect that freedom and equality in the 14th Amendment. And they heard testimony, the drafters of the 14th Amendment, about the extraordinary, horrific, brutal denial of rights to enslaved people. And some of the most wrenching testimony dealt with the lack of bodily autonomy, particularly as it relates to reproductive choice, the ability of people to decide for themselves whether to have a child, to determine for themselves whether, with whom, and when to have a family. Those rights were brutally denied to enslaved people. And so the idea that you could make those decisions for yourself was part of the irreducible minimum of liberty that was protected in the 14th Amendment. That history is, of course, completely absent from Justice Alito's opinion. And instead, he looks to state practices at the time of the 14th Amendment in 1868 and around then that in some states, but not all, they get that wrong too. In some states, they did not make abortion legal. But the 14th Amendment was not intended to enshrine unjust and inequitable state practices forever. The 14th Amendment was intended to disrupt discriminatory state practices. I mean, it was coming after we had half of the states enshrine slavery in their laws. So the 14th Amendment was not trying to enshrine forever these discriminatory state laws. So the idea that you would use what was happening at the time when there were discriminatory practices now is just madness.
Right. As if that were right, what they were doing, right? 200 years ago. And whatever happened to the phrase stare decisis, which all of these justices, at least in their confirmation hearings, said was so important?
Yes, exactly. So first and foremost, the right to abortion is rooted in the Constitution itself. And that's what we were just talking about with respect to the 14th Amendment. But even in addition to that, Roe versus Wade, which recognized that constitutional right, has been a workable precedent for 50 years. It has been reaffirmed time after time by the Supreme Court, including more conservative courts as well. And so if you, as a justice, are going to overturn that precedent, you need to go through a very solid analysis talking about whether or not there have been any changes to the law or the facts. And as the dissent pointed out, there have been no changes in that regard, other than the fact of who sits on the Supreme Court.
Right.
And change of composition of justices is not supposed to be the way in which stare decisis analysis works, but it appears that's exactly what happened now.
Did these justices lie in their confirmation hearings?
I don't know what they said in private to Susan Collins. That's on her conscience. But, recognizing that Roe is a precedent is a fact. I would have liked to have dug a little deeper on whether they understood that the Constitution protects the right to abortion. Because to me, as a student of the Constitution, as a scholar of history, if you don't know that it does, then you don't deserve to be on the Supreme Court. So I wish they would have pushed them more on that and not just let them get away with saying Roe is a case that's been decided, because that's obviously true.
What does it say to you that John Roberts admitted that he didn't want to go this far and he didn't think the court should go this far, but he voted with a majority anyway?
Yeah, so he wrote a concurring opinion that said, I would not strike down Roe and Casey. Yeah. I would simply uphold the Mississippi law. But, in a way, that's just going in the same direction without being as transparent about where you're headed. If Roberts's concurrence had been the majority opinion, they still would have been gutting Roe and Casey. They just honestly wouldn't have been as transparent about what they were doing. And the Alito opinion leaves no doubt that, they are going after not just abortion rights, but other incredibly important rights of liberty. And Justice Thomas's concurrence makes that clear, saying he wants the court to reconsider precedents that protect the right to contraception, that protect the right to decide intimacy questions for yourself, and marriage equality.
I thought it was pretty apparent that Justice Thomas talked about same-sex marriage as one of the rights that should be also questioned. He didn't talk about interracial marriage. Just want to point that out.
Well, I think he would probably say, the Loving versus Virginia decision, which said that states cannot ban interracial marriage, was in many ways an equal protection decision and not solely substantive due process. But I would point out that there are very strong equal protection arguments for abortion as well. And they're just pretending that those arguments aren't there when in fact they are.
Is the answer for the Senate to codify Roe v. Wade?
I think certainly it would be appropriate for Congress to do that. It's an important liberty and freedom and right of equality and bodily autonomy that it is absolutely appropriate for Congress to use its enforcement powers under the Constitution to enact such legislation. And look, a lot of people will say, well, the Supreme Court might strike that down. They might. You should do it anyway.
Right. And the president saying that he would certainly support amending or the filibuster or dropping a filibuster in order to codify Roe v. Wade. What else can the president do? A lot of people have been critical of Biden, saying the administration is not doing enough. What can they do?
Well, I think, obviously they've had some time to think about it. And I think perhaps some of the frustration has been that they haven't stated particular concrete steps that they could take. Obviously it's important to ensure that they use whatever mechanisms they can in law and policy. Obviously working on legislative solutions is important, and they can use their bully pulpit and their leverage in that way. Thinking about what the Department of Justice can do, making sure that the right to travel interstate, the right to travel is also protected by the Constitution, working to make sure that that liberty is protected. Also with respect to medication abortion and the provision of abortion under federal insurance schemes. There are ways that, I think that a lot of folks hoped they would be a little more concrete about.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.